Tonight on Nova, no American city takes more pride in its architecture than Chicago. So when Chicago sponsored a competition to design the nation's largest public library, architects jumped at the chance to make their mark. 5 world-renowned finalists were chosen. Now they are locked in a struggle to be the best to blend art, science, and a fixed budget into an edifice that will capture the spirit of this grand city. Who will win the design wars?
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. Emerging from Lake Michigan, a legend of an American city comes into view. Known as windy for both its climate and its politics, it is so desperately flat, it had to create its own urban mountains. With the railroads, stockyards, and Al Capone gone, architecture assures Chicago a lasting place in history. Since the legendary cow set Chicago on fire in 1871, the building boom has never ceased. Bob Brugman teaches architectural history at the University of Illinois.
Chicago was a boom town in the 19th century. It grew from almost nothing in 1830 to one of the largest cities in the world by the turn of the century. In the 1880s and the 1890s particularly, these great buildings went up, made possible primarily for 3 technical reasons. One of them was the passenger elevator. The second one was new developments in foundations and technology. And the third was the development of a steel frame skeleton. One of the interesting things about Chicago is the passion with which Chicagoans view their buildings. For Chicago, building is not just an ornament. Chicago is about building. It's about building superbly, building carefully, building to meet the program, but also having a certain kind of grace and elegance as well.
Ever hungry for new buildings since the Great Fire, Chicago has become the Mecca of American architecture. It has gotten this reputation by fostering 20th century modernism through the innovative expression of new structural technologies, but also by mimicking the ornamental classics of history. This apparent contradiction is rooted in Chicago's struggle with its self-image, according to Stanley Tigerman, the Dean of Architecture at the University of Illinois.
So Chicagoans, every time they get a chance, they always turn back to an earlier time to establish authenticity in the eyes of others, predominantly their Eastern counterparts. Example, the Chicago Tribune building that was done by Raymond Hood, New York architect, and happened to be a building that used another kind of architecture, neo-Gothic, to produce that sense of verification that's been absent. So the innovative context of the exposed skeleton frame, the skeleton of architecture, so to speak, was never sufficient evidence for Chicagoans to believe in themselves. They required language as antecedent, as a precedent, to show that they were legitimate, that the hog butchers of the world, the people described in that marvelous book called The Jungle at the turn of the century about the stockyards, that was not sufficient evidence. And a kind of architecture that was as raw as that red meat in the stockyards was not sufficient to convince Chicagoans of their own value. They required traditional views. That still is with us today.
One of those buildings influenced by the old world is the Chicago Public Library. It was built a century ago and became a white elephant the day it opened. Limited shelf space competed with bad acoustics. When the city's book collection grew to 2.5 million volumes, the need for a new building was obvious. Library Commissioner John Duff.
We have 72 miles of shelves designed for this building. We will have over 8 million volumes. housed eventually in the Chicago Public Library. But it also will be a building that will be on the cutting edge of modern library technology. Scattered throughout the building will be scores of microcomputers which will enable the patrons to hook up into all parts of the collection. We will beam programs to every one of the 80 or so branch libraries and to schools throughout the city. A student will be able to go into his high school library, say to research a subject like Chicago as a rail center in the 19th century. He will be able to see what is held at the Central Library on that subject and indicate on his computer, his notebook as we call it, that will print out the books that he wants, and they will be delivered to him the next day at his school.
A location search began with much controversy. The 2 corners across the old library could not be acquired, and no other location could be agreed on by civic groups. When the mayor offered $40 million for this vacant department store to renovate it as a library, the Chicago Sun-Times called it the scandal of the century, accusing the mayor of selling out the dream of a new architectural landmark for Chicago. Finally, a location was chosen, and a parking lot in the middle of downtown was ready for what would be the largest municipal library in the country. Elizabeth Hollander, Commissioner of Planning.
Other public projects normally are done by hiring an architect and then putting out bids for the contractor to do it all. But the last 2 major public projects in Chicago using this technique had come in way over budget and didn't meet their deadlines at all. So there was no public confidence in that approach. So we thought, well, how else might we do this? And it was suggested to us that we do something called a design-build competition. Now, competitions are well known for public buildings. The important word here is a design-build competition, which means that the competitors are not just architects, but they are a team of architects and builders, private sector builders. Why is that important? Because the builder has to certify that what that he can build what the architect has designed at the price we set and under the timetables that we set. And this was somewhat controversial because the architects had to respond to the realities of the builder. But we felt that this was the best way for the public sector to get the public excitement of a competition, but one in which all the constraints of time and money were built in from the outset.
Of many who met these criteria, 5 architects teamed up with developers were selected and pledged to build the library for $140 million in 950 days. With only $50,000 each in pocket money, the winner-takes-all competition began. 5 architects in search of a library. One of them is Dirk Lohan, now in the process of expanding Chicago's Shedd Aquarium into Lake Michigan. Arthur Erickson, a highly acclaimed Canadian architect, is also in the running. His latest project is the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. The third competing team is America's largest architectural firm of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Mexico's renowned architect, Ricardo Legarreta, was invited to be co-designer along with SOM's partner, Adrian Smith, whose latest credits include Boston's Rose Wharf and the AT&T Tower in Chicago.
This should really be steel, too.
Helmut Jahn, designer of the United Airline Terminal at O'Hare and the State of Illinois building, is also in. Thomas Beebe, a former Chicagoan, now Dean of Architecture at Yale University, rounds out the list of competitors. He has already built one Chicago branch library, a small one. The first problem these architects face is the historic Chicago elevated train, which divides the 2 city blocks designated for the library. They can either build across the tracks and have the train zip through the building, or use only the left side, which is what Tom Beebe intends to do.
This is one of the most important historic sites in Chicago. On this side here, you find some of the earliest office buildings in Chicago. William LeBaron Jennings built the Manhattan block before the turn of the 20th century. The old Colony building was built approximately the same time. The Fisher building, which rises above the Van Buren Street and the L at that point. This is the old historic core of the office building center of Chicago. It provides a wall on State Street
of consistent facades. So State Street becomes a room, and our site faces onto this room. And one of the notions of our building is, within this kind of commercial context, how do you build a building so that it looks, although it occupies the whole site much the same as a commercial building does, that it'll look like a public building.
Granite base, which is rusticated, like a heavy rustication, like, let's say, on the Rookery or the Auditorium.
The first sketches on the walls of Beebe's studio point to classical libraries.
Building a certain power and sense of mass to it. There's a lineage of libraries, which I think has something to do with this building. And it probably starts with the Le Brousse Library in Paris, the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève, which has large arcaded openings like this and a rather kind of flat wall. It's much flatter than this, but it suggests the idea that there's a large reading area behind it in the Le Brousse Library. Although we have floors that run behind it in this case, the idea of the imagery of that facade, which, by the way, is extremely influential because the Boston Public Library, which was done in...
Bob Winslow is Beebe's developer. He agrees with Beebe that their building should look historic.
You know, there's certain prototypes that develop in that. One is like the Greek temple facades, where you have a pediment that runs the length of the temple.
And oftentimes sculptures sitting along the
Sculptures sit on top like acroteria.
From a long ways away, it looks like a sculpted object, which is sort of one story, very intense form. But as you get closer, you see it breaks down. The windows, you realize it's a multi-story building. You know, that's what all these elevations are all about. It's all about trying to juggle all these problems, the interior and the exterior, to get it together into one intense form that says that it's a library, and that's one of the ideas.
Thomas Beebe has added a small pedestrian bridge over busy Congress Street to facilitate access to his library. He imagines the transformation of what is now a busy urban highway into a Chicago boulevard with plenty of trees and a statue of the late Mayor Washington, whose name the library will bear. The L track will be kept undisturbed. The main feature of the building will be 6-story arched windows. Thick walls made of granite and brick, and the penthouse winter garden will be topped by a roof adorned with Greek-influenced ornaments. In his State of Illinois building, Beebe's competitor, Helmut Jahn, sends government to the balconies and offers the public a giant atrium stage. Some fellow architects call him an arrogant European imposing on America a kind of modernism that deprives her of history. Others admire his sense of building for the future. In his 36th-floor cupola overlooking Chicago, he explains his decision to build over the elevated train.
This is a very interesting site because it is a site which is somewhat on a perimeter. It's actually not only one side, but it's two sides. And not only are there two sides separated by a street, but those two sides are also separated by what I would call a strong physical barrier, the elevated tracks, which to some degree maybe have some nostalgic attraction, but is really something you wouldn't want if you had your choice. This really led us to the decision that it become physically and literally a bridge connecting the north and south area.
This is the world of Helmut Jahn's design, dashing, exciting, charismatic. Jahn thinks architecture should ignore past notions of civic grandeur and discover a monumentality of today.
Modern architecture is often more rigorous and takes a little bit more issues with things, and it becomes a little bit more controversial and less conventional.
To his United Terminal at O'Hare, he brought a feeling of motion. He says his message is freedom, and it applies to the library as well as to the airport, as long as modern man is the user.
To make people feel like when they come to the end of the tunnel, that they didn't waste any time.
Jahn draws in airplanes, hotel rooms, or wherever he finds himself, and sends his celebrated sketches to his office in Chicago, where every Jahn model is on display. Jahn designs supermarkets, critics may say, but he takes it as a compliment. In the age of technology, he argues, a library is a supermarket of information. Brian O'Connor is Jahn's associate on the library project.
People like spaces that are exciting. They like, it kind of uplifts them. They go in and they say, wow, this is, I've got to go to the library. It's not a very interesting thing to do anyway, especially kids are going there or something. They come in to look at books, and if it's a great space, they walk in, they say, wow. He started out with this sketch, which was to show how the building would have a top. And then he added this sketch was to how the inside worked. This facade has to have the strength that it finally did. What's building here is white, it's blank. What's drawn is the space. And he added this as to how this outside space would work.
A wooden model emerges from Jan's drawings. He describes his facade as a giant, partially filled bookshelf, incomplete as knowledge is. Geometrical figures housing shops and a restaurant are placed under this elevated building. Behind them is an indoor mall, 80 feet high, a new gathering place for the city.
No, this probably shouldn't be solid blacks, I tell you.
The reading rooms become intimate glass porches hanging out over the street.
We'll have to work that out, but I think at some
By
point
filling the entire site, Jan created a building 700 feet long and only 6 stories high, as opposed to at least 10 stories projected by those who do not build over the track.
That would be the other color. When you come in this area, you'll be able to see all the way up the building, this atrium, and you go up from here to there, but we call not an atrium, but an internal street.
when we talk about security, are we talking
Lee
about
Estabrook is the Dean of Library Science at the University of Illinois and Jan's consultant. The needs outlined by the city for the new library seem to lend themselves to a square, box-like building. Both Jan and Estabrook challenge the notion of the box, arguing that horizontal distance can be shorter than vertical when the time spent on stairs and elevators is taken into account. They now make sure that nothing a box can do for the library can't be satisfied by their long shelves.
One is that you have no real collections down here, is that right?
No, that's correct.
Okay, so you take out some collection space, and let's say this is the main floor right now.
You've got to take pieces of this and put them back downstairs.
Yeah,
right?
I want to put...
You want to put this down?
I want to put all the collections down here.
Have you got the colors?
I've got a few of the colors, actually.
Wait a minute. No. This goes in here.
Yeah.
I'd like to see it.
Afraid that plastic would not effectively represent his building's marble and granite grid, Jan uses for his final model birchwood, stained in different colors. His answer to those who oppose the length of his building and the crossing of the L track is that every inch left to commercial development can ruin the stamp a public building can put on a city. For renderings of the library, Jan chooses watercolors to enhance the impact of his indoor street.
This site is...
Dirk Lohan thinks crossing the tracks would violate the Chicago grid system.
We have the east-west axis here of Congress, which was the symbolic dividing line between the north and south in the Burnham Plan. And going north and south, dividing the east and the west side of Chicago is State Street, which is also, of course, the zero line in the Cartesian grid of the city. So it's a most important location. You could say it's the heart, it's the center of the city in terms of its planning. Another very important aspect is that this end of town is surrounded and still filled with buildings of stone, masonry, granite, brick, a lot of brick, unlike the more northern part of the city. And I felt very early on that it would be important to build a building that would be somewhat contextual to this surrounding feeling of the southern end of Chicago's loop.
Frame analysis, surface
In Dirk
shading,
Lohan's office rises another library.
some more massing studies, proportioning systems, detail.
The main feature of Lohan design is a high-tech looking roof containing all mechanical systems and pointing out that this is a library that leads into the next century. Lohan calls the two ends of his library the bookends and sees them as a reference to the commercial surroundings of the site, while the recessed middle of the building provides the glamour of a cultural institution.
Intent being
to be a contextual building on the perimeter, and then carve out our modern library in it. And the height of this and coming out to the property line, it frames State Street as State Street is meant to be.
In developing a modern facade, the Lohan architects wanted transparency, exposing the life of the library to the street.
Structure exposed.
Access of light to the building became a critical issue.
And we don't have the depth and the play of the sunlight that we once had, and I think we're getting closer to an applied ornamentation, and that's a big concern of mine. If we took this portion of the roof out and have the sunlight pierce it and through that slot that we once had, I think that would really be a strong statement.
You can't just eliminate, let's say, something like this or like that, because
the reality of budget constraints affected the Lohan team exactly the way the city predicted when it chose the design-build concept. His developer, Metropolitan Structures, is just about to report that the skin of the building and its roof structure may blow the budget by a couple of $1 million.
Budget without changing the character.
You're going to have a spandrel.
In traditional design, the cost of construction is determined by bids from various contractors. Here, the contractors have to commit themselves before the design is completed. So the team looks for ways to save money.
There's a system where you put the stone right on the precast, or I could see you don't have any weather dependent. You throw this precast up, rain, snow, sleet, or hail, and you've got an enclosed space. And then we can take our time with the handset stone.
That looks a little tricky to me.
The block back up?
Yeah, with a block, handset granite or stone.
After solving the budget problems, the Lohan team builds its final model, stressing the transparency of the building. Knowing that the competition will be a contest between the modern and the traditional, Dirk Lohan positions himself in the middle. He sees a danger in creating a building from an image of the past. At the same time, Lohan, the grandson of Mies van der Rohe, thinks the dogmatic modernism of his grandfather is too abstract to satisfy today's ethnic and cultural diversity.
Incredible. It's a great model. I hope the jury will like it.
Mexico City is the birthplace of yet another library. Ricardo Legarreta recalls how he lost his idea of crossing the train track to his Skidmore developer, Richard Stein.
This was my first reaction to the problem, which was the connection between the two properties through a bridge and really integrate the elevated train into the two buildings, and then have something on the corner that could become really a kind of an emblem of the library, and giving all that importance to it at the entrance. At this moment, we didn't care too much about windows, but we were talking already about shapes and proportions of it. The reaction from Richard Stein was that this was too complicated, too expensive to build on top, and the employees will not be able to walk so much between the different parts of the buildings. So we started to work in another direction, and then we came introducing all the urban image of it, and we started, without forgetting my idea of having the element in the corner, I wanted to create the plaza, because I still felt that the elevator was very important. So I did this. I took all the building on top of it, but I built the plaza in here. And by that plaza, we give importance to both sides, and something else can be built over here, but it still belongs as part of the library and the plaza. The criticisms came saying, this is not typical from Chicago. The height is not the type of treatment of the buildings in Chicago. We should bring in something. But I wanted to keep the space, so I decided to bring something like this in there. And by that, discussions, ideas, and movement of people, then came what you could say a little bit of a compromise for a Mexican architect building in Chicago, which was this. In here, we started to, you can see that we start to have much, let's call it Chicago images, the arcades, still maintaining the public space but much more enclosed in order to be more adapted to the climate of Chicago, still the ceremonial entrance on Congress, and entering from state in a very simple way. From here, by analyzing program detail, cost, budget, etc., we came to this one, which, as you can see, is much more of the Chicago image, playing already with a corniche, but I still wanted to keep this element, which was the vital I was talking some time ago, about having all the reading rooms with the vital in here, not losing the emblem of the entrance, but and at the same time showing the public space. And you can see how different the images have been playing from one to another.
Here is the Skidmore's computerized Chicago skyline and its newcomer.
Another one.
Looks pretty good.
The main attraction of this design is a 12-story tall atrium with transparent elevators and escalators, allowing visitors to virtually fly over the library stacks and reading rooms which surround this huge opening full of daylight. This atrium becomes the focus of internal circulation, as well as the organization of the library divisions, each of them wrapped in stained glass and characterized by its own color scheme.
So what I'm going to do...
Skidmore design emerges from the most sophisticated computer program of any architectural firm in the world. Here in Chicago, 150 of these powerful machines have revolutionized the way buildings are designed. Architecture becomes a kind of experimental science where ideas can be endlessly tried.
This is the fastest guy alive.
In this way, the Skidmore Library comes to life. Back in Mexico City, Legarreta is working on his special contribution to the project.
Let's take these pieces here.
In addition to a highly functional library, the city encourages the competitors to dream up a public space, adding civic importance to a building.
Of construction, but I see much more.
The team came up with the idea of a great hall, a courtyard that will open to the street in the summer.
This element here. This space is public space. It doesn't belong to the library, and we are treating the same. That's why I'm very much against the...
In this unobstructed space marked by classic columns, the Mexican architect wants a bit of anarchy, with massive freestanding elements inviting the public to gather around.
This is the kind of columns I would like to see there. Wow, 4 of them. Almost as strong as this element, more reference to the facade. I think that doesn't mean that we cannot have this beam here. The beam doesn't have to show a mezzanine.
This is a computer look at the Legarreta Skidmore Great Hall.
Do this all in yellow.
Richard Stein, the developer of the Skidmore Library, takes charge of the presentation to a jury composed mostly of laymen unfamiliar with architectural jargon.
It's an idiot board, this goddamn idiot board. Okay? It's on the ceiling, and that is something that is monumental, and it's something that I doubt anybody else is going to give, and that's where we busted the budget, and we got to make it pay.
Right.
Stein's message is that his library, not flashy on the outside, exhilarates on the inside.
We've got another view of this coming up.
Okay. Okay. Do you remember my last objection 2 weeks ago with this was we have no scale here. We have no people.
We will.
Okay.
We will.
I heard that last time. We got to have it for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Because right now that looks like it's 16 feet tall, and this looks like it's 80 feet tall.
Oh, I understand. No, scale figures are part of all this.
So while other teams use pencil and paper for the exhibition drawings, SOM comes with 3-dimensional cross-sections and floor plans showing the layout of each reading room to the accuracy of one reading table and the people seated around it. Made of laser-cut plastic elements, the model shows multicolored textures of granite and limestone on the walls, as well as a metal barrel-vaulted roofline and tinted glass windows.
Okay.
By far the most expensive of all the models, this one was 8 weeks in the making in 2 cities. It arrived in Chicago from Los Angeles on 2 first-class airline seats. Arthur Erickson has the reputation of a sculptor who creates exciting spaces filled with light and water and surrounded by stone. Steps seem to be his passion. In Vancouver, Canada, where he lives, he built over 200 of them to elevate the entry to this courthouse, offering a generous public space. In Chicago, I wouldn't pass up the opportunity of building over the L track, he tells his developer, John Buck.
Really, the L train is one of the things that is very sacred to Chicagoans, and to bring it right into a building. You know, I think what's marvelous about it is the way it runs through these canyons of streets, and to really now bring it in and through and under a building, so that, and to have a station stop there, so that anyone going to the library can get off, go into the library. It really brings the library into the very active transportation system.
In his office in Toronto, Arthur Erickson's design begins its life. 50 styrofoam models were made to refine the cylinder-like shape of the Erickson Library, challenging Chicago's square tradition.
What? What's your bugger? Okay.
The main attraction of his design will be a public park and winter garden in front of the building, placed on both sides of the elevated train.
It's just slightly higher.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, taller.
Can a foreign architect build in Chicago? Yes, but he needs a guardian angel. The Chicago firm, once involved in the idea of turning a department store into a library, helps Arthur Erickson in his design. Ray Oversat and Vic Vickery are in charge.
So this window goes up to the stand.
We're not Vancouver. We don't have that kind of mild climate. So therefore, a number of the design approaches were simply not appropriate for our climatic conditions in Chicago. We'd create snow slides down very steep pitched roofs. So we had to begin to modify forms.
I was called the sheriff to say that, you can't do this, you can do this. So it was a lot of give and take. I think we finally arrived at a solution that satisfied the library program, and then we started to work on the dollars.
We couldn't sheathe the entire building in stone. We began to price this out with the contractor and found that we were way over the budget.
These would be solid and would be concrete structure, faced with stone, minimizing...
When the entire team meets in Chicago, Erickson will find out how much his ideas will cost and be asked for compromises. After all, the winner in this competition is also expected to give the city the most value for its money. The subject today, can we really afford a winter garden?
I am not convinced that a large expenditure at that location is giving us the full bang for our buck, if you will.
Weeks later, the first Erickson model arrives in Chicago.
I think we ought to just go ahead and build it anyway.
The winter garden and an open plaza with a reflecting pool of water remains in the design. In Erickson's opinion, a real gift to the city.
Piece of cardboard, so it looks a little more transparent.
As in all his buildings, light is a major consideration. In this design, he spaces the windows in such a way that the reading rooms are filled with cheerful light while books are protected from the sun.
So this is stacks.
In the core of his library, he sandwiches the reading rooms between two layers of stacks.
Referred to as the reading trays.
Made in Toronto's Chinatown, the Erickson plexiglass model is mounted on fluorescent light fixtures, giving the library a glowing effect at night. The elevated train will stop at a station enclosed by the building. After a 20-hour drive from Toronto, the final model arrives in Chicago.
Wait a minute.
The bad news is that the box is 2 inches too large to fit into the freight elevator.
We've gained probably, what, 2 inches?
Vic Vickery must now find the right elevator to bring the model to his 15th floor suite in the Chicago Tribune Tower, famous for the architectural competition of the early 20s. Then, 260 architects competed for the job. Today, only 5 could afford the costly bid for the library, where up to $1 million could be spent for an entry. Such a ruthless race is possible only in a city obsessed by its architecture, say out-of-state observers.
There isn't a Queen Anne front and a Mary Anne behind. It's a kind of a building that is exciting all the way around, from all the vistas.
Erickson calls his library an Athenaeum.
Even from Plymouth
In ancient Greece, a temple of Athena was the place where writers and scholars met to celebrate knowledge. Helmut Jahn's entry is on its way to the old library exhibit hall, where Chicagoans will be able to view all the models for 3 weeks. In addition, the city will create an audiovisual presentation of each team to be shown in all 18 library branches for feedback from the librarians and the users. Members of the competing teams are anxious to be the first to know.
I think it's interesting, don't you? I think this is an interesting building. I don't think it's anything risky. I think it's interesting. It's a nice, decent building. I don't think it's anything that I'd be surprised to see.
All right, guy, there's so much guy.
Oh, look at the subway down here.
That does look like Paris in the 19th century. You know, we all have different contexts. Some are more Chicago and some are less Chicago.
They lit it up too.
It's the most extraordinary model.
That's wild.
This pyramid is the bookstore.
The city's librarians can't wait to see what's in store for them. Commissioner Duff.
This is spectacular. And there's such a wide range. We've got couple here that we would say are traditional library style, and a couple that are certainly avant-garde. There are all kinds of ideas incorporated in these that, as I heard somebody say, would be a wonderful thing to build these buildings all over the country.
Among librarians, Dirk Lohan's design seems to be the front runner. Chicago architects Jay Carroll and Melvin Skvarla concur.
It doesn't look like it was done by a committee like the Skidmore program.
This is the Chicago window. This is the way it was used on the Carson Perry Scott building, the Goldblatt's building, right down State Street, which is in context.
You know, I also especially like the plaza here. And remember, we were recommending that it face State Street and the main entrance be on State Street and not on the busy highway of Congress. It seems like it's all encompassing as to what should be there. And they're nice open floors. They're not long and narrow like Helmut Jahn's.
The Arthur Erickson scheme, I think, would be fine in a country setting. It is not Chicago. It's not context. It's something from the 1930s. It almost has that look of Buck Rogers to it. The department store of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, it does look like a department store. The Beebe scheme, it is almost a replica of a building built 100 years ago. We have it at the Auditorium building. The Auditorium building will have its 100th anniversary. Now, are we going to build another building 100 years later?
If this were a private building, the decision would be made in the corporate boardroom. But this feels like an electoral campaign with the candidates politicking and building constituencies.
We treated those elements as like little buildings.
So right through this, we felt the building had to be very straightforward.
This is one of the largest public building projects in North America. The message to the world is loud and clear. The city of Chicago has the will and the ability to complete large projects. The exhibition is a testimony to Harold Washington and your leadership in these kinds of projects.
I live in the downtown area 24 hours a day, and my concern is principally with the late evening and weekends when the loop is fairly deserted. This is my neighborhood. This one says, let's tell everybody that tradition is the big thing. This one says function. I imagine they took the floor plan and decided what would be the best arrangement on the floors and let the elevations take care of themselves. This one has many great qualities. It does say, here I am, I'm a public place.
The architects now have their final word, as this unusual architectural debate begins with the jury on stage and all Chicago listening.
Interior street, which stretches all the way from Congress Street above the elevated tracks and then terminates in the entry building to the north of the building.
It's a very lucid building. By getting it over the L, completely over the L, by taking over both blocks, you then can have these stacks in one long go from top to bottom, tightly put together, so you read from front to back. You then have this atrium space running all the way along, organizing that, and then you have the reading rooms out towards State Street. But there's a price paid, and that is the whole building is floating something like 35 feet above the ground. So my question is, what do you really think, aside from rushing past those 35 or 40 feet, which is where we started by having good, fast escalators and so on, aside from getting up those 35 feet, what do you imagine the whole underside, the whole under part of the building doing? How do you handle it? How do you keep it from just being a void?
I mean, I believe that just because of the scale, the character of this open space which leads you to the building, that it is somewhat monumental, and that it is maybe out of scale in terms of its size to what the human being is, it nevertheless, there's an attempt made to scale down the elements of the building, the larger elements, into smaller elements.
I come from New Haven, Connecticut, where we had a classical library by Cass Gilbert, very carefully designed by him to work contextually with the old churches on the green. And my friends and I were very much not scholarly and very unaristocratic, I might add. And going up to that door with its two columns, and then going into that domed reading room, that whole grandeur and symmetry and final rest of the architectural movement was part of that sense that for us, that reading was a grand and liberating activity. And indeed, that door was the door to liberty. That was the door to freedom for all of us. Well, you say you're creating a new kind of library, and I look at it and I ask myself, what is this new freedom here? How are you achieving it? And as I look at it, it seems to me it has to do largely with a corridor. It has to do largely with movement. I don't find those places of fulfillment and rest.
Monumentality, in its neoclassic form, has been symbolic of great empires, wealth for the upper classes, and creates associations of establishment dominance, and not of a free democratic society. Civic presence must incorporate and evoke the feeling of fairness, openness, equal opportunity, accessibility, and yes, governmental humility. Having said that, does not mean this building should not possess a timeless permanence, but it must achieve it with contemporary means coupled with an architectural composition that relates it to the relevant examples in the history of architecture.
It takes a special building to survive in Chicago. If it can measure up to the context, a building in this city also enters an honor roll in the public memory.
But whose choice should it be anyway? Who is the one to know what best serves public taste, if such a thing even exists? The city thinks these people should know. The jury is made up of 10 men and 1 woman.
Very important.
None of them is a politician. Only one is an architect, 2 teach art history, 1 is a librarian. Others are a former broadcaster, a banker, a publisher, a businessman, a civic leader, a social worker, and a public housing developer. Critics of the design-build competition concept point to the lack of client-architect collaboration in the process. With its final word, now the jury becomes the ultimate client. Long before they assumed this role, the city stuck its professional nose into the submissions and now, careful not to intimidate the jurors, whispers its findings to them.
So when Buck said yesterday we ran a bunch of options, they did. They ran 6.
One of the characteristics of this
There are
building
3 areas of evaluation: the design of the building, how it meets technical specifications, and how it fulfills the library program.
The building, particularly in the main entrance on State Street, they showed pictures of bands in it and being programmed, and it's hard to imagine a space with those hard surfaces being effective acoustically and a real useful kind of public space.
The children's library is on 2 floors. No elevator or washroom on the north end of the library. Poorly arranged units in literature and language, visual and performing arts.
Somebody mentioned that earlier, a couple of days ago, it seems.
After 2 days of listening to the architects and to the city, the jury will retire behind closed doors, away from the leak-hungry Chicago press, to reach consensus. The chairman of the jury recalls the flavor of the deliberations, Norman Ross.
When our jury sat down to make our recommendation, we decided that we shouldn't exploit the concept of the hero architect, the man who reinvents with every project, reinvents the wheel. We knew that there should be architectural dialogue between the past and the future, that the city's urban fabric should be respected, that the loop is an entity that shouldn't be thoughtlessly broken into. That our buildings should relate to architectural masterpieces. It should be functional, it should be flexible, it should be architecturally handsome. A lot of work, a lot of creativity, a lot of money, a lot of caring went into this building. So we decided to go and see the models themselves and then one by one go about the course of elimination. This is the Skidmore, Owings and Merrill building. It uses materials, granite and masonry, that are very, very good. It's a highly functional building with a very beautiful atrium and 2- and 3-story reading rooms. The exterior, members of our jury felt, was really not very good. It was disappointing. It strove for monumentality, but it succeeded only in being massive. It was a good idea to have a Mexican and American collaboration among the architects, but in theory it was fine, but there were too many cooks spoiling the broth. They canceled each other out. This was the first one we eliminated. This is Dirk Lohan's design. It was the librarian's favorite. They felt that it really had the aura of being a winner. But the jury didn't feel it was that exciting. We did like those very big, beautiful lamps, 20 to 30 feet high, but we thought without them that the building would look like a factory. We liked very much the interior, particularly the grand entrance and the part of the building that was just inside there. But there was a feeling that Dirk Lohan really tried too hard to be contextual with the rest of the architecture in the city, and they ended up with a weak design and an ununified design. The building is precise, it is utilitarian, it is functional, it's not very exciting. Someone said that it looked very much like a Macy's department store that had been built in Chicago. Somebody else said that it was the kind of a building that so no one would walk across the street to see. It was the second one we eliminated. This is the Arthur Erickson design. It was the people's choice. They thought it was a beautiful design. They thought it was an elegant design. They liked very much the way it crossed the L tracks, for instance. They liked the plaza. They liked the fountains. One of our jurors thought it was one of the two most exciting designs we had, and that it would one day end up on postcards and be used for years to come. Though striking at first, the appeal faded. Somebody said it looked like a Houston or a Marin County shopping center. Somebody else said that he wasn't aware that visitors from outer space had landed. But the real problem was the question of the park at night, and would people feel safe there? The problem that's so often the problem in urban design. This was the third we eliminated. This is Helmut Jahn's design. Those of us on the jury felt that he really understood our historic elevated train and how to work it into his structure. We saluted him for his panache, for his clarity, for his generosity of his scheme, and the disciplined but very lively exterior that he came up with. One of our jurors said that it was a great building and worthy of Chicago, and that he did not doubt that this was the architect's very finest performance. Somebody else said that public architecture should stretch the limits of acceptable taste and not hide behind tradition. He too was in favor of this design. I felt that if I were going into some of the other buildings, I'd be restful, maybe I'd fall asleep over my books, but that if I wanted to live and work in the 21st century, that then I'd better stay awake when I was in this library. Somebody said that the library looked as though he had designed the building, but then had stuffed the library inside. It was with a heavy heart that some of us voted. 2 people thought he should be the winner, but it didn't make it. This was the Thomas Beebe design. One of our jurors said that it may be great architecture, but that it isn't exciting, that it's too safe, that it isn't appropriate for the 21st century. Another said that this winter garden, which is up on the top of the building, is elitist, that it would be used by the staff much more than by the public. But the majority of the jurors felt that this is the best design as far as pure architecture is concerned, that it's solid, that it's a gentle building with noble spaces. It has thick walls, it's humane, it's beautiful. And it does something very important. It addresses Congress Street to the south of the building. And if you were to build the park that's been dreamed of across Congress Street, it would also be very helpful. This was part of the dream of Daniel Burnham, who was the father of Chicago urbanism. This is a building that you can trust. The interior, state-of-the-art, it's a flexible building, and also the windows have a genuine feeling of grandeur. The exterior is consistent with the other great buildings that are around it in this neighborhood. This looks like a library. This is it.
Thomas Beebe, the winning architect, on the new library site.
To be on the site today, after the months of working on the competition, the intense activity, it was also quite surprising for me to see the other competitors' schemes and how they related to ours. I mean, my sense was that our take on the project was quite different than everyone else's. I mean, we really believe that this institution should be represented in a way as a cultural institution and not a kind of futuristic idea of a library. What we were really interested in was the notion of the traditional values of a library could somehow be translated into a building that would represent a kind of institution which everyone would understand, that would be moving actually the people of Chicago. In a sense, it's a magnet for this area. When you imagine the new building put into this kind of a situation, the condition of this neighborhood, the way it's changing, it's an area of transition. A building this magnitude will have an incredible impact, I think, on this area. As such, I think that's appropriate, because the library should be the center of the city, and it should be a positive force.
The Leonardo da Vincis and our democratic society bring their talents to an open market of business schemes, design ideas, and technological solutions. We don't make it easy for them to be the dictators of our taste. A postscript by Stanley Tigerman.
Beebe's is the best building, but just of those submitted. And had I been on the jury, I would have premiated Beebe's scheme. But by selecting that scheme, it sends Chicago backwards away from its own future precisely the way that the Tribune competition and the Columbian Exposition did, because it's a building that's a study in dissimulation, that feigns to be something of a time that's not ours, that uses as a role model a building that is the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève in Paris by Henri Labrouste as its role model. That's the problem with a kind of thinking that uses context to establish authority and uses verification of an earlier time to get over the insecurities of the natives of a city trying to seek authenticity.
And so goes the story of a great American city searching for excellence in architecture. Let's hope that no one's creative wings have been clipped in the process. The next Chicago Public Library may not be built for another 100 years. Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS.